The music swelled. The guests stood. The doors opened. The bride stepped forward, glowing in white, walking toward the man who was ready to love her forever. But forever never came. Because before she could reach the altar, before she could say I do, the doors burst open again. This time, it wasn't for love. It was for death. Gunfire ripped through the air. The dream wedding turned into a massacre in seconds. Screams. Blood. Chaos. And when the smoke cleared, the bride and groom lay motionless, their vows never spoken, their future stolen. What kind of hate turns a wedding into a crime scene? What kind of monster destroys the mother of his own children on the day she was supposed to start a new life? This wasn't just murder. This was revenge. This isn't just a crime, it's a brutal reminder of how love can turn deadly. She thought she was finally free. That the past was behind her. But some men refused to let go. And on a day meant for happiness, they chose to make her suffer instead. Welcome to True Dark Crime Lab, where we uncover the most shocking crimes and the twisted motives behind them. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. Sasha Wilkins, 32, was a woman who had seen the darkest sides of life and still fought to create something better. As a Florida correctional officer, she walked the cold hallways of a prison every day, face to face with men who had lost their freedom. She understood danger. She understood violence. But she never expected the biggest threat to her life would come from her own past. For years, she had carried the weight of two toxic relationships. Jamal Briggs and DeAndre Fulton, two men who had once whispered love into her ears, only to turn into nightmares. They had given her children. They had also given her heartache, betrayal, and years of struggle. Both had been in and out of prison. Both had promised to change. And both had failed. She had spent too many nights crying herself to sleep, wondering why she kept giving her love to men who only knew how to break her. But Sasha refused to be another statistic. She worked long shifts, pushing through exhaustion to build a stable home for her children. She refused to let them grow up watching their mother suffer. And then, she met Damian Cole. Damian was different. A 34-year-old paramedic, kind-hearted, hardworking, and nothing like the men she had left behind. With him, she felt something she had never known before, safety. Damian loved her without conditions, without control, without threats. For the first time in her life, Sasha could breathe. Their love story was built on resilience, two people who had seen struggle but chose to build something stronger together. The wedding was meant to be her fresh start. Her chance to finally leave behind the chaos, the fear, the pain. But what Sasha didn't realize, what she never could have predicted, was that her past wasn't willing to let her go. It was watching. Waiting. And planning to destroy everything she had fought so hard to build. Jamal Briggs, 36, had never been the type of man to take no for an answer. When he wanted something, he took it, by force if necessary. His relationship with Sasha had been nothing but a cycle of passion and pain, fueled by manipulation, threats, and violence. He would break her down with cruel words, then pull her back in with empty promises. When he hit her, he always found a way to make her believe it was her fault. And for too long, Sasha had believed him. Jamal spent years in and out of prison for drug offenses and assault, yet in his mind, he was never the problem. It was the system. It was the world. It was everyone else. And Sasha? She was supposed to wait for him. To stay loyal. To belong to him, no matter what. DeAndre Fulton, 38, was no better. A man who thrived on control, he was jealous, domineering, and always watching Sasha like she was still his possession. Even after their relationship ended, he refused to accept that she had moved on. He would show up unannounced, calling at all hours, demanding to see their child as an excuse to stay in her life. And when she tried to push back, DeAndre reminded her of what he was capable of. Sasha was strong, but no woman should have to live in fear of the men she once loved. Both Jamal and DeAndre had convinced themselves that Sasha was theirs forever. And when Damian Cole entered the picture, everything changed. Damian was everything they weren't: stable, loving, a real man who took care of Sasha without fear or control. He wasn't threatened by her independence. He didn't need to intimidate her to feel powerful. He gave her the kind of love neither Jamal nor DeAndre had ever been capable of. And they hated him for it. They saw him as an intruder. An enemy. A man stealing something that should have been theirs. So when they found out Sasha was getting married, that she had chosen Damian over them, that she was about to officially close the door on them forever, it sent them into a blind, uncontrollable rage. They weren't just angry. They were ready to kill. The sun hung high over the Florida skyline, casting a golden glow over the elegant outdoor venue. Rows of white chairs lined the garden, delicate rose petals scattered along the aisle. It was a scene of pure love, a dream come to life. Sasha Wilkins had spent years fighting for her happiness. And today, she was finally going to have it. She stood in the bridal suite, draped in a breathtaking white gown, her hands trembling with excitement. This was more than just a wedding. This was her freedom. Her new beginning. For the first time in years, she felt untouchable. Nothing from her past could reach her here. Or so she thought. Across town, in a beat-up car parked just outside the venue, two men sat in silence. Jamal Briggs and DeAndre Fulton had never been allies. They despised each other. For years, they had fought over Sasha like she was a prize to be won, each believing he had more claim over her than the other. Jamal saw DeAndre as weak, a man who talked big but never backed it up. DeAndre saw Jamal as reckless, a fool who only knew how to use his fists to get his way. They hated each other. But today, their hatred had a different target. Sasha. Or rather, the man waiting for her at the altar. Damian Cole. Jamal clenched his jaw, gripping the gun in his lap. "She really thought she could erase us," he muttered, his voice low and bitter. DeAndre scoffed, shaking his head. "She thinks she's too good for us now." There was no love in their voices, only rage. Sasha had chosen someone else over them. A man they both saw as a threat. A man who had stepped into the life they believed should have been theirs. It wasn't just about jealousy. It was about control. They weren't going to let her walk away. Not like this. Not in front of all these people, acting like they had never existed. She was theirs. And if they couldn't have her, neither could he. The ceremony had begun. Soft music played as Sasha made her way down the aisle, every step taking her closer to the life she had always dreamed of. Guests wiped tears from their eyes, smiling at the sight of the radiant bride. Damian stood at the altar, his heart pounding with happiness. He had waited his whole life for a woman like Sasha. Strong. Resilient. Everything about her was beautiful. He could barely contain his joy as she reached him, her fingers slipping into his. They exchanged quiet smiles, lost in their own world. For a moment, everything was perfect. And then, the doors burst open. A thunderous sound shattered the peace, followed by a scream. Gunfire. Loud. Relentless. Sasha barely had time to register what was happening before the first bullet struck her. The impact sent her stumbling backward, a sharp, burning pain ripping through her chest. Her breath hitched, shock taking over before the pain truly settled in. Damian's eyes widened in horror. Sasha. He lunged forward, trying to shield her, but more shots rang out. The guests erupted into chaos. People dove under tables, some scrambling to escape, others frozen in terror. More bullets flew. Damian felt a sharp, searing pain tear through his side, but he didn't stop moving. He reached for Sasha, catching her just as her knees buckled. Her once pristine wedding dress was now stained crimson. Blood poured from her wound, soaking into the fabric, turning her into a vision of tragedy. Her lips trembled, her body shaking in his arms. Damien cradled her, pressing his hands over the wound, trying desperately to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, baby," he begged, his voice breaking. Her eyes fluttered, glassy with pain. The love they had fought so hard for was slipping away. Jamal and DeAndre stood at the entrance, guns still raised. Their faces were unreadable, cold, detached. The same men who once swore to love Sasha were now the ones taking her life. The guests' screams filled the air, but neither of them flinched. They had done what they came to do. And now, it was over. The room was a battlefield, the wedding a massacre. Sasha gasped, trying to speak, but no words came out. Damien held her closer, whispering words of love, of promises he could no longer keep. His own body was failing, blood pooling beneath him, but his only focus was on her. Their dream had ended in a nightmare. And as the gunmen turned to leave, slipping back into the chaos they had created, the realization set in. Sasha had fought so hard to escape her past. But in the end, it had killed her. The aftermath was a nightmare. The once beautiful wedding venue had become something unrecognizable. Instead of laughter and music, there was silence, heavy, suffocating silence. The air still smelled of roses, but now it was mixed with gunpowder and blood. The aisle that Sasha had walked down only moments ago was covered in red. Her white dress lay in the middle of it all, drenched in death. Damien's body was sprawled beside her, his arms still wrapped around her as if he had died trying to shield her. They had come to celebrate love. Instead, they had witnessed horror. The guests stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Some sobbed uncontrollably, clutching each other for support. Others were in shock, staring at the scene with wide, unblinking eyes. A woman's scream pierced the air, raw and filled with agony. Someone else fell to their knees, rocking back and forth, repeating, "No, no, no, this isn't real." The sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Help was coming. But it was already too late. The paramedics rushed in first. They moved quickly, checking for signs of life. One knelt beside Sasha, pressing 2 fingers against her neck. Nothing. Another medic hovered over Damien, shaking his head before murmuring, "He's gone." Their voices were quiet, respectful, but their faces betrayed the truth. This was a scene they wouldn't forget. Sasha and Damien had no chance. The bullets had done their job, tearing through them with deadly precision. Blood pooled beneath them, seeping into the wooden floorboards. Their hands were still touching, fingers barely intertwined. Even in death, they reached for each other. The police arrived next. Squad cars screeched to a halt outside the venue, officers rushing in with their weapons drawn. The first thing they saw was the carnage. The bodies. The blood. The shell casings scattered across the floor. But their targets, the men responsible, were nowhere in sight. "Suspects are on foot," an officer shouted into his radio. 2 black males, armed. "We need backup now." Outside, Jamal and DeAndre ran. Their plan had never included getting caught. They had thought they could blend into the chaos, slip away before the sirens got too close. But adrenaline could only take them so far. They hadn't planned for the streets to be swarming with cops. Jamal ducked into an alley, chest heaving. DeAndre was right behind him, cursing under his breath. "Damn it, man, we should have just left right after," DeAndre hissed. Jamal's eyes were wild, unfocused. "She was mine," he muttered. DeAndre gave him a disgusted look. "She wasn't yours, fool. That's why we're in this mess." They both heard it at the same time. Footsteps. Shouting. The police were closing in. Jamal reached for his gun, but before he could raise it. Bam! A force knocked him to the ground, a knee pressing into his spine. A second later, DeAndre was tackled, his face slammed against the pavement. Don't move. The officers moved fast, pinning both men down, yanking their arms behind their backs. Cold metal snapped around their wrists. It was over. The same men who thought they had the power to decide Sasha's fate were now powerless themselves. As they were hauled to their feet, Jamal struggled, his face twisted with fury. But DeAndre didn't fight. He just stared ahead, blank, as if he knew this was where he was always meant to end up. At the station, the mood was eerily calm. Jamal and DeAndre sat in separate interrogation rooms, their hands cuffed to the tables. One officer flipped through a file, not even looking at Jamal as he spoke. You killed the mother of your child. And her fiancé. At their wedding. In front of dozens of witnesses. Jamal smirked. She doesn't get to move on, he said, tilting his head. The officer's jaw tightened. No remorse. No regret. Just arrogance. Jamal acted as if Sasha had betrayed him, as if she had deserved what she got. As if her happiness had been a crime. But the only crime here was his. And he was going to pay for it. Across the hall, DeAndre sat in silence. The detective in front of him waited, giving him a chance to speak. But DeAndre just stared at his hands. They never would have let her be happy, he finally murmured. The detective frowned. They. Jamal. Himself. All the men who had tried to claim Sasha like she was property. Men who never knew how to love, only how to possess. She didn't deserve that, DeAndre muttered, almost to himself. The detective leaned forward. Then why did you do it? DeAndre's eyes were empty. Because if I didn't, he would have done it alone. He let out a bitter laugh. And then I wouldn't be able to live with myself. The news spread fast. By the next morning, the entire city knew what had happened. The community was in mourning. Sasha had dedicated her life to protecting people. Damien had spent his days saving lives. They were good people. People who deserved a happy ending. Instead, their love story ended in blood. And the two men responsible. They weren't sorry. They never would be. But the justice system was waiting. And for the first time, they were the ones who couldn't escape. The trial was never about proving their guilt. That part was obvious. Jamal Briggs and DeAndre Fulton had walked into a wedding with loaded guns and left two bodies behind. There were witnesses, dozens of them. Surveillance footage. Ballistics. DNA. Blood-stained clothes. There was no question about what they did. The only question was whether they would show an ounce of remorse. They didn't. Jamal entered the courtroom in shackles, his head held high, his face set in defiance. Like he was proud. Like he still believed Sasha had belonged to him, and if he couldn't have her, no one could. DeAndre was quieter, but his silence wasn't guilt, it was resignation. He knew where he was headed. This was just a formality. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted the picture for the jury, a woman who had spent years trying to break free from her past, only to be hunted down on the most important day of her life. A man who had loved her, fought for her, and died at her side. A wedding turned war zone. A massacre. The evidence was overwhelming. The bullets that tore through Sasha and Damien were fired from the very guns Jamal and DeAndre had been found with. Witnesses had seen them pull the triggers. There was no insanity plea to fall back on. No self-defense argument. No excuses. Just pure, cold-blooded murder. The defense tried to spin it as a crime of passion. They acted in the heat of the moment, one attorney argued. They saw the mother of their children moving on, and emotions took over. The words rang hollow. This wasn't passion. It was possession. It was control. It was two men who believed that Sasha wasn't allowed to be happy without them. And the jury saw right through it. DeAndre stared at the table, his hands balled into fists. Not once did either of them say they were sorry. Not once did they acknowledge the lives they destroyed. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. On all counts. Double homicide. Premeditated murder. Use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. Each word sealed their fate. The courtroom was silent as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. He looked down at the two men before him, shaking his head. This wasn't a moment of rage, he said, his voice steady and cold. This was a calculated, deliberate act of violence. He glanced toward Sasha's grieving family. They didn't just take two lives. They took a mother. A daughter. A woman who deserved happiness. He turned back to the killers, his expression hard. And for that, I have no mercy. Jamal and DeAndre sat motionless as the words fell like a hammer. Life in prison. Without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. Some wept. Sasha's mother collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing. It was justice. But it was justice too late. Jamal was led out first, his smirk finally gone. Maybe, for the first time, he understood, he had lost. DeAndre followed, his shoulders slumped. Neither of them would ever see freedom again. But what did it matter? Sasha and Damien were still gone. A love story that should have lasted a lifetime had been reduced to bloodstains and courtroom transcripts. A wedding had become a funeral. And two children would grow up knowing their fathers weren't just criminals. They were murderers. The case made national headlines. People were horrified. A crime so brazen, so senseless, so tragic. Experts debated what could have been done to stop it. But the truth was simple. Sasha had tried to leave her past behind. She had tried to be free. But some men refused to let go. And sometimes, obsession doesn't end in heartbreak. It ends in murder. Sasha Wilkins wanted love, but in the end, love was what got her killed. She had worked hard, raised her children, and finally found a man who treated her with kindness and respect. Damien Cole believed he was marrying the woman of his dreams. He never imagined he'd die on his wedding day, his last moments spent shielding the woman he loved from bullets that were meant to tear them apart. Jamal Briggs and DeAndre Fulton had every opportunity to walk away. To let Sasha be happy. To be fathers instead of executioners. But their pride, their possessiveness, their obsession wouldn't allow it. They let their rage consume them, trading their freedom for a lifetime behind bars. They didn't just take Sasha's life. They stole a future that was never theirs to begin with. This case is more than a tragedy, it's a brutal warning. Some people will never accept being left behind. Some men would rather destroy than see a woman they once controlled find happiness without them. Love can be beautiful, but in the wrong hands, it can also be deadly. Sasha thought she had escaped her past. She thought she had finally found peace. But sometimes, the people you once loved are the ones who want you dead the most. And on her wedding day, love didn't win. Jealousy did.
On March 12, 2023, police in Vancouver